Welcome everyone. Thanks for joining for today's talk, which will look at the field of altmetrics, give you an idea of what altmetrics is, and show you some of the data that you could work with when you become interested in this field of study after today's talk, probably. And we have to give you a little bit of background before we enter the actual field of altmetrics, because it's connected to a broader area of study that is often called scientometrics, the approach to study scholarly communication and how researchers behave in this communication system. And we start with a little background on bibliometrics and then move on to altmetrics as an alternative approach. So publications and citations, hence the biblio in bibliometrics for the reference to a book, to an actual book, but it could also be a book chapter, a paper, or anything. But publications and the citations they receive have long been at the core of scholarly communication. This is the process of how researchers share their ideas and react to each other's work. And therefore, what we observe is some sort of information flow from the published works of researchers to new potential research work in progress that is inspired by them, receives the information from the work that one has read. And in exchange for this information, the previous works that we build upon receive a citation. So in the formal process of referencing what we have read, we cite other people's work and therefore give them credit for what they have done. And the fine thing about this is that this leaves a trace. So we can see who has cited whom. We can get the data of which paper or which book is citing which other publication. And these traces have been used in the field to study scientific communication and to study how researchers work for quite some time. For example, this kind of data plays a big role in understanding scientific communication in total and for investigating the sociology of science. It can be used to analyze structures of the scientific field, for example, collaborations between disciplines, between different countries, between different people. It can investigate patterns of scientific discoveries, specific research trends, and it can also be used to identify influential researchers and their networks. So just some quick ideas of how that could look like. This, for example, is a world map in which countries are inflated by the level in which they receive citations from other people. So publications that have been published by researchers with an affiliation in the United States apparently receive quite a huge amount of citations worldwide. And as you can see, some other countries would be rather underrepresented based on the number of citations. So this is something you could look into based on these digital traces or based on the traces that researchers leave in the process of citing each other. This is another example, and I'm not sure if you can read it, but the little words in there are all university names. So what we're seeing here is a co-authorship network in which we look at the affiliations of researchers and who is collaborating in the sense of publishing together with whom, and we can see how Harvard University, for example, is in the center of the big red bubble over there. And these approaches are being used to understand scientific collaboration. So this is just a very quick glance at what can be done when you want to study scholarly communication. The field of measuring scientific publications and citations has another dimension, which is more practically relevant maybe to all of you, even if you don't aim to study these kind of things. Because by now each and every scientist gets to some degree measured based on citations and publications as well. They have become the key currency for measuring scientific impact. And some things you might have come across in the past could, for example, be author profiles like the one on the left on Google Scholar. So here we see the number of citations for a given author, and a quite highly cited one in this case. So don't get too afraid by the high numbers here. And what you see is that a number of indexes have been created, like the H index and other equivalents, to measure the impact of an individual researcher based on publication output and citation they receive. So this would be on the individual researchers level, but of course there are different levels in which can be measured. On the right image, we see the SciMargo journal rank indicator. So in this case, we are looking at the impact of a specific scientific journal. And again, here there are different indicators. The original idea for this is the journal impact factor based on Thomson Web of Science. So this is an indicator that many people look for when they want to judge whether a certain journal is of high quality or not. Unfortunately, though they are very widely used, these impact measures all come with lots of challenges and limitations. So they are all not without flaws, and you have to be quite careful when using and interpreting them. And these are just some of the limitations. There's a whole field of study dedicated to this, and a lot more in the nitty-gritty details that we don't talk about today. But just to give you some ideas, first of all, of course, publishing a paper takes time. Publishing another paper that cites the first paper also takes time. And this makes these indicators that are based on citations rather slow. So it takes time after one person published a book to accumulate a number of citations for that, and therefore show whether it's really impactful or not in the scientific community. Very often, citation practices and publication practices can also not be compared across disciplines, meaning that many different disciplines have their own standards, what they expect as, for example, the frequency in which people publish, the detail of what is being cited. And for example, in some humanities, you would rather write a whole book, whereas in other fields, you would rather publish several papers or several conference papers. So this is really hard to compare across disciplines. Typically, we also do not easily distinguish why someone is citing something. So it could be because of approval, which might even be the typical case, but it also could be to criticize someone and therefore to actually negatively mention this other work. And it could be for very different reasons, like self-citations in order to promote one's own work, or other reasons behind it. And another limitation, and that is one that is going to be of importance for us when we switch to the Altmetrics part, is that these traditional citations only measure impact within the scientific community. So it's a very specific type of impact that is being measured, which is the impact within other researchers' activities, but not beyond that, not into teaching, not into a broader public, for example. So these are the two that Altmetrics are addressing to some degree. Altmetrics, and the Alt here stands for alternative. So it's supposed, or it was suggested as an alternative way to measure impact to scholarly work, since traditional bibliometrics approaches based on citations would only consider this within academia ecosystem of attention, but it wouldn't capture any form of attention or impact within the general public, within media, within education. So Altmetrics were a suggestion to broaden up the scope by adding other ways to trace activities of interactions with scientific products or researchers. And the idea was to use, for example, data from social media, from other media sources, from other online interactions with scientific products or people, which would also make this quicker to respond to things that are going on. So as you know, reactions on social media can come right after the publication of a new paper, for example. So this was also another advantage of promoting this new field of altmetrics. Social media platforms are kind of at the core of altmetrics, but they are not the only data that is of relevance here. And I just want to again give you some first examples of what can be done with this kind of data, or how does scholarly communication might look in these contexts. And a few examples would, for example, be a Twitter, a tweet, a Facebook post, or another online post that mentions a published paper, for example, by including the link or the DOI, and then saying something like, I just read this, or this looks super interesting, something like that. It could also be the list of references used in Wikipedia articles as a sort of interacting with these scholarly publications. Or it could be some ways of marking interesting stuff, for example, in bookmarking systems like Mendeley or Cite You Like, or other networking platforms where you can bookmark something that you might want to read later. But it could also include news reports, scientific findings, general download statistics, views of article pages. So there's a lot of alternative things that you might want to track of general internet users interacting either with scholarly publications or with researchers' profiles in online environments. So one first example, just to get an idea of the broad scope of these different things that might be possible, now looks at individual researchers. So we will highlight one way to look into potential impact of individual researchers, and in this case, this will be done based on Wikipedia page views. So assume that a lot of very notable researchers might at some point get a Wikipedia page about them, and there are ways to track how many people look up these Wikipedia pages. And one interesting case that Olga and some colleagues have come across when looking into researchers' Wikipedia pages is the case of Vera Rubin, and she's the researcher who discovered dark matter. And she has not been awarded a Nobel Prize for this, although every now and then there were quite some initiatives of promoting that she should be a person to receive the Nobel Prize for physics, for example. And in 2008, there was a specific Twitter campaign where people promoted the idea that Vera Rubin should receive the Nobel Prize. And so what can be done, for example, then is to look into how many people look up the Wikipedia page of Vera Rubin as the researcher, or in comparison to other researchers. And in this case, we compare the page views of her biography with the views on the two researchers that then later were awarded the Physics Nobel Prize in 2008. And the green line above is the high attention of page views for Vera Rubin, and the others are Makoto Kobayashi and Toshihide Masukawa, who then received the Nobel Prize. And before the announcement of the Nobel Prize, it looked like this. And around the time of the announcement, it then turned like this. So at that point, the two actual winners of the Nobel Prize, of course, received much more attention than before, and also in comparison to what Vera Rubin received before. This also shows us that external events like receiving an award might change what we can observe with social media data. So apparently here there was an external event that kind of led to this sudden increase of interest in specific researchers. And these are things that we always have to keep in mind, that the data is not isolated, that there might be events that change what we can observe. Another example now looks at citation practices in social media environments, and for this case we turn to YouTube, which might not be the most immediate choice, but it's definitely a place where a lot of papers are being mentioned, and this looks, for example, like this. So on the upper left you can see a screenshot of a sort of educational video about brain blood vessels. So this is from a video channel that posts these kind of science explanation videos. And in the video description, which is a bit small here, but somewhere around here, you can see a link to a published paper. So in the video description, the video authors include a link and therefore citing some published paper, and the published paper is the one you see on the lower right, which actually is a paper about gut microbes and the brain. So this is how a non-scientific interaction with a scientific paper could look like on YouTube, for example. And these kind of data can be used to then study public attention on scientific papers in this YouTube ecosystem, for example. And we are working on this example at the moment, and just one very small piece of what we're looking into here is, for example, that we look at the research areas, the disciplines where papers are coming from that are being mentioned in these YouTube video descriptions. And it's a bit hard to read, but the highest shares of videos in our data set come from health sciences, medicine, life science, biochemistry, physical sciences. So a lot of STEM categories actually being present here, and videos interacting with these papers. So even in case you are not aiming to study any Altmetrics data yourself, it might still be interesting for you to learn a bit about what's going on here, because it's not only a new field of research that is interesting for computational social scientists, it is also of practical relevance for a lot of researchers, since it's being implemented by publishers, for example. So when you go to a publisher page like PLOS One, you might come across things like this. So this is an article on PLOS One, and it has these information here. So in addition to the number of citations this article has received, we can see how often it has been shared, and that includes Facebook, Wikipedia, Twitter mentions, for example, or how often it has been saved on Mendeley and Cite You Like. So these are additional metrics here, and it might help you to judge the current relevance of a paper, but it might also be interesting for you to check these things for your own papers and how your own work is being received. In the case of the PLOS One platform, researchers have also looked into how the different indicators that you just saw correlate with each other and correlate with traditional citations. And in this case, the PDF downloads, HTML views, and XML downloads, they have the highest correlation with traditional citations as measured on other platforms. Yeah, in case you consider practically working with Altmetrics data in your own research, you basically have different options of getting data from different types of data providers. For some cases, you can get data directly from the social media platforms. For example, from the YouTube API, from the Twitter API, from Reddit, from Wikipedia. You can get the data directly from these platforms, and then have to figure out for each of the platforms what options you have, what data limits, for example, there might be, how far you can go back in time, these kind of things. You might also need data from traditional citation databases, such as Scopus, Web of Science, or Google Scholar, where people provide, or where the companies provide publishing information, which papers have been published and how often they have been cited. And these are often commercially, and you have to pay for getting access to the data. And then there's a category about which we're now going to talk a bit more, because it's specific for this field and might not be well known yet, and that is so-called Altmetrics aggregators. And these are companies or services that provide a one-stop access to both publication data and the mentions or interactions they receive from different social media or alternative platforms. And what Altmetrics aggregators are collecting is, on the left-hand side in the blue bubble, information about scholarly products, papers, books, and so on. And on the right-hand side, mentions on, for example, social media platforms, news, and other sources. In our YouTube example, this would correspond to these kind of things. So in the red circle, we would have the YouTube video that we just saw. And in between, there's the link created by the mention of a published paper in the video description. And then on the left bubble, you have the actual publication in a medical journal that is the cited work in this case. And maybe keep this image in mind, because it will reoccur in some of the next slides. So the blue and the red bubble you will find again when I now hand over for my colleague Olga to conduct the rest of the talk.
Yes, thank you, Katrin. Hello, everyone. And now I will continue with explaining you which aggregators you have, which limitations they have, and what can you do with them. So basically here I provided for you the list of well-known aggregators on the market, and I will go just briefly through them, and then you can read more details about it from our slides we provide you. So the first two is Altmetrics.com and PLOS. This is they are more or less similar. So basically, they collect data from all over social medias like Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, even Pinterest, and so on. And I will come to them in a few minutes. And then there is also another one, which is called cross-event data. And exactly this aggregator is completely free and publicly available, and one can use just their free API. The only limitations to this one would be then that they only tracking basically publications that have a so-called document identifier DOI. Probably maybe some of you have heard of it. But this is the only limitation of this cross-ref event data, but still, if the publication has DOI, you can collect it. You can use this aggregator. Then a little bit another aggregator is Impact Story, where the previous three, they are collecting data, let's say, for any publications, and you can just search for some publication by using author name or title or field of study or whatever, whereas the Impact Story is sort of a service that helps basically authors of publications to see their own mentions. So basically their own mentions in social media for their publications. For that, you just need to have, for example, an ORCID ID or register in this Impact Story service, and then you can download all the list of all your publications or import them from Elsevier or somewhere else, and then they will track it for you. The another one is Lagota. So basically this aggregator is a bit different to those all another four, because this is not really an aggregator which you can access in the web. This is a software which you can basically create your own instance on the server, and then for your own publication collections from your institutions or from your department, and then you can collect the Altmetrics for them. And this is a completely open source API they provide the data for. And one instance of this Lagota for some time was available on the PLOS One journal. Then I also listed for you two other platforms, which is called ResearchGate and Mendeley, and probably many of you have heard about them. This is social media and bookmarking platforms, which where you can basically read the publication from your colleagues or peers, and then just to show what you are reading or bookmark something for you interesting. And also they are showing the, for example, views or reads of every publication, and those metrics like views or reads, they also Altmetrics basically, and that's why I showed you that. So now let's move basically a bit forward, and I will specifically cover a bit more about this two another aggregators, altmetric.com and PlumX. And first I would like to start to tell you a little bit about those sources they are using, basically where they are tracking those publications. And according to altmetric.com, and also what you can see there, so basically they are tracking the, a list of preselected mainstream outlets and magazines, and where basically you can get, for example, the number of news stories that mention some scientific publication or number of outlets where it was found. Here they would basically use two types of mining. So first of all, they would mine using the link recognition, where they would utilize identifiers, for example, or ISBN numbers. And second one, they also utilized some sort of text mining, where they would use their author name, title, and venue, for example, that information, and get try to find the match. Okay, and of course everything comes with some limitations, and for this mainstream media, the limitation would be that for this text mining basically mechanism, they only can use it for those articles that have DOIs. Also, they basically mine Wikipedia references. They mine Facebook posts, but here one has to mention that, for example, for Facebook posts, they only track basically the public pages. Also, they don't even track the likes for those public pages or reactions to those public pages. And here, the limitations come from overall accessibility of data from Facebook. So even if some private person would publish, let's say, write on their timeline public posts where they say, oh, here I have read this and this is a super cool paper. Also, guys, read it. Altmetric and any other aggregators, they would not be able to track them because due to just privacy issues, and that we are not allowed basically to mine the private data. And that's why, but still they can track the public pages, and public pages are basically those, for example, institutional page, publisher page, or organizational page, and basically those pages, they are also mentioning scientific publications, and those data basically you can see on altmetric.com. So altmetric.com also collects Twitter data, tweets, Reddit posts that are mentioning scientific publications as well. Okay. Also has to be mentioned that altmetric.com is collecting also the data from different recommendation and reviewing platforms such as faculty opinions, PubPeer or Publons. And here, of course, the limitation would be that some of those reviewing or recommendation platforms, it might be only applicable, for example, for certain fields of study, where, for example, this is formally called F1000, is basically only for biology and medical sciences. Also, they are showing the data basically from Mendeley and Cited, like those are bookmarking platforms I was mentioning earlier. And also, altmetric.com is showing us the demographical, for example, data for Mendeley users that were mentioning publications. And those data can include the country of affiliation, and also whether the person is a professor, has a PhD, or it's a PhD student. Has to be mentioned that, of course, Altmetrics.com also collects the data from YouTube, Stack Overflow, and Stack Exchange specifically. They are also tracking patents and the mentioning patents, the public policy documents, and they are also doing tracking the references in Open Syllabus project for around like 4,000 institutions worldwide. Okay, so, but let's come back and sort of which exactly publications they are tracking. And what comes here is that Altmetrics.com not only collecting their pure research publications like from journals and conferences, but also the gray and white literature. And how they are doing it? They basically, as I already mentioned a little bit about it, they're utilizing basically this list of identifiers. So identifiers of the documents. And some examples of them could be like archive ID for preprints on archive, or DOIs for different publications or data sets even, and also the ISBN number and number of a book. Yes, this is, yes. Okay. And also I would like to point to you that those aggregators, in many cases, they also provide their own aggregated metrics. And they also have their own representation for the visual representation of those Altmetrics, which publishers or institutional repositories can use also for free. For example, in case of altmetrics.com, those would be so-called donuts. So those donuts, you as a researcher, you can use just on your private web page, or the publisher, maybe you have seen them already, using them just to show basically what was the interest in this publication. And here the colors of those donuts would mean from which exactly social media those metrics come from, and the number in the middle would be the so-called attention score. And the attention score is basically weighted count basically of all attention some research output had received, which would be weighted along three dimensions. First, how many different people have been posting it, from which source is coming, and who are the people who've been mentioning it. So, and I would give you just several examples. For example, the mentioning in news outlets would be weighted a bit more than a mentioning of such some publication in a Twitter. Or for example, for Twitter, they have a different classificator for people, for users, where they would classify them to the researchers, practitioners, and practitioners, for example, are clinical or researchers who is working in a clinical research. They also have science communicators or journalists also category. And here, for example, the researcher would be weighted a bit more than a journalist, yes, because many of science communicators, they post really a lot of new publications, and they are a little bit then down-weighted. Yes, and now you probably would be wondering how you can get access to those data. In case of altmetrics.com, they give the two basically possibilities. One is sort of institutional or publishers access, which is sort of prepaid and you have to sign some contract. But for researchers in scientometric fields, and not only in scientometric fields, but for the researchers who want to get the data for their own research, their data, they can give a free access. And basically, for that access, you have to apply for. And here I provided you the link where you can go and just read it carefully, and you can sign for it, and then you will get the data. But also one has to specifically, for example, specify which exactly access they want. And here Altmetrics is providing like 3 types of access. One can get access to their Explorer, and Explorer is basically the visual web application where you can search for publications for all sorts, for institutions, for different research fields and so on, and see visually and get some quick data from it. Then they have also access to the Altmetrics API, and also they have the full access. And in order to get this free access, by the way, you have to briefly describe basically your project, why you need this data for, and I guess you will get the data. Okay, and the second example I will just briefly point to is basically PlumX. PlumX is really, let's say, similar to what altmetrics.com is doing, but with a slight difference that they are provided a bit more granular data, basically. For example, they would not only provide number of videos that are referencing YouTube videos, I mean, that are referencing in the description some research publication, but they would also show, for example, in this usage section here, what is the number of video views, or what is the number of comments that have been left behind that video. And just similarly to altmetrics.com, they're just providing the data not only for pure research publication, but also for literature, let's say, and also even for some reports or some government documents. Yes, and with regards to access, basically, the artifact level, basically PlumX pages, the pages just I showed you on the previous slide, that one you can see for every publication, let's say on the Elsevier publisher web page. But if you want to get the API access basically to data, you have to apply for that. Yes, but collecting the data is coming up with the challenges. And the first of all, it's in transparency of how the data is mined. So for us researchers in the field, basically those aggregators, it looks a little bit like a black box where those aggregator providers, they are showing us only certain data, how exactly the data have been collected, and other part remains for us uncovered. So we have no idea how, for example, certain aggregator is collecting data, exactly collecting data from Cited, like bookmarking platform, for example. We just know that they are trying to find some links, but exact mechanism, it's not super transparent. So, and that then come with some inconsistencies that might happen and variations that can come across different aggregators. And here I want to point you to one interesting research that have been done by our colleagues from Leiden. And what they have done, they for the set of around 30,000 publications, they collected the data for Mendeley reads in this case from four aggregators, mainly Mendeley, Altmetrics.com, Lagota, and PlumX, and then they compared basically. So for how many research publications you would see the same numbers, and what they, for example, found that if one compares the data obtained from Mendeley and Lagota, you would find the same number of Mendeley reads for about like 50% of publications from their data from their set, and for 46 you would get more data, more numbers from Mendeley website itself, and then for 5% they would be even less on Mendeley than what the Lagota is showing. So as you see, basically the data can a little bit vary, so you just have to keep in mind. So you have to, if you decided to basically use the aggregator, you have to basically collect, select one source and don't merge those sources. This I want just to point you to. So, but also what comes very specific for Altmetrics is basically they are super dependent on the time of aggregations. And as Katrin already mentioned, so basically, of course, the one privilege is that we can very quickly collect the data and Altmetric data. We don't need to wait for it. But on the other side, the data obtained from social medias is very quickly changed. So a lot of posts or tweets are deleted with time. So just take in mind, just pay attention to when you collect the data. If you want to collect it from different sources, just do it at one point in time, such that the data is comparable. Yes. Yes, and just if you want to see your own Altmetrics, I would like to recommend for you, for example, the platform which is called Dimensions, and I would like to ask Katrin to post in the chat this link. So after this talk, you can check it and just to see what you are interested in and try it out. Yes, and so what I want to highlight, so basically the Altmetrics offer us this so-called alternative view on scientific impact, and that might help you to see how general public interacting with your institutional scholarly publications. But we have to take in mind that on the one side, this new data helps us to basically to see the new forms of computational social science research, but also it comes with own challenges. Even if you decide to collect on your own the data, you will still get a lot of challenges with it. Yes, and also the Altmetrics might be just relevant for your individual research in your day-to-day life, and just try it yourself and have fun with it. Thank you very much.